Man, what is it with FGO and turning joke characters into absolute queens? Hello everyone, Soberoni of G&A Reviews here, with a spotlight for the servant that you know you're all going to roll for regardless of what I say in this review, Demon King Nobu. We'll be examining her stats and skills, as well as going over pointers to how to utilize her effectively, and an overall grade, comparing her to how she stacks up to the other 5-star servants. So if you're ready to be Nobu Mama's little pog champ, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and ring my bell so that you can catch all of these spotlight videos as they go up and help out the channel. Now, onto Nobu's stats. Nobu has a max HP of 11,761 and a max attack of 12,641, which becomes 13,905 due to her Avenger class modifier. Compared to the other Avenger class servants, Nobu has the lowest HP in her class and only average attack. However, compared to the rest of the 5-star servants, Nobu's attack ranks amongst the highest in the game, while her HP is tied for the lowest. When it comes to her command cards, Nobu has 4 hits on her quick card, 4 hits on her arts, 6 hits on her buster, and 5 hits on her extra card. She has an NP gain rate of 0.49% and a star rate of 5.9%. Overall, Nobu's stats are heavily geared toward offense, making her more of a glass cannon. Nobu's NP gain is also underwhelming due to her heavy buster card deck, while her star generating is a little better than average due to her high hit counts. Taking a look at her skills, Nobu's first skill is It's Inevitable rank A-. This skill increases her own attack every turn for 3 turns, between 20% and 70% depending on both the level and the turn number. It also grants her a Burning Battlefield buff for 3 turns, and inflicts burn on her as a demerit, draining her HP by 1000 every turn for 3 turns. Nobu's second skill is As If It Were a Dream rank B. This skill grants her 1 turn of invincibility and also increases her own buff removal resistance for 1 turn between 50 and 100% depending on level, and the skill can be upgraded through a strengthening quest which turns it into As If It Was a Dream rank B++, and grants it the additional effect of increasing Nobu's damage against sky attribute enemies so long as she's on a burning field between 30 and 50% depending on level. And finally, Nobu's last skill is Demon King of the 6th Heaven rank EX. This skill grants her between 5 to 10 crit stars every turn for 3 turns, and also charges her NP between 10 to 20%, both depending on level. As for her passives, Nobu has Avenger rank B-, which increases her own NP gain when taking damage by 17.5%, but it also reduces the party's debuff resistance by 7.5%. She has Oblivion Correction rank E, which increases her crit damage by 2%, and Self-Replenishment Magic rank C, which charges her own NP gauge by 3.3% every turn. Moving on to her deck and Noble Phantasm, Nobu has a Buster deck with Quick Arts, Buster, 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 and a Buster Noble Phantasm. Her Noble Phantasm is Hajun Henjo Sanzen Daisen Tenmao, which is an AoE Buster attack that removes all divine enemies' defensive buffs, as well as inflicts damage to all of them with between a 300 and 500% damage modifier, depending on level. It also inflicts them all with burn, dealing 1000 damage every turn for 5 turns, and it deals additional damage to divine enemies between 150 and 200% depending on overcharge. Nobu is an Avenger, so she doesn't require any class pieces or skill gems for Ascension. Instead, however, Nobu does require a whole lot of different Ascension mats. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to list off the mats that she needs, and in the description of this video I will include a link to the drop rate table so that you can see for yourself where these mats are going to be best farmed. For level Ascension, Nobu needs 10 bones, void dust, lamps, gears, grease, bloodstone tears, gallstones, and wine, while for her skill leveling, she's going to require 10 horseshoes and chains, 12 lamps, spinal fluids, and magatamas, and 15 bullets, bells, and reactor cores per skill. Demon Nobu is without a doubt one of the most aesthetically well-designed servants that we've ever gotten in FGO. But how well does that visual design translate to actual gameplay design? Well, stat-wise, Nobu definitely favors firepower. Her attack is one of the highest in the game, especially considering her beneficial class modifier. But she does pay for this high attack by having the lowest HP stat among all 5 stars in the game, as well as poor NP gain due to her triple buster card deck. Nobu's star generating can be decent if she's able to land a quick card or a brave chain, but she can be inconsistent with that due to her aforementioned buster deck. Thankfully, Nobu does have more flashiness and versatility in her skills. Her first skill, It's Inevitable, grants her an attack buff that scales higher every turn up to 70%, and it also generates a burning battlefield for 3 turns, all at the cost of burning her for 1000 HP every turn. At max rank, this skill is basically a monstrous strength that transforms into a mana burst after a turn, and then into a super mana burst the turn after that. In terms of raw damage buffing, this is one of the strongest self buffs in the game, so if Nobu can get a Buster Brave Chain off while this skill is on its 3rd turn, it can be devastatingly powerful. The keyword being if. Since the major drawback of this skill, aside from the demerit, is that it's very hard to time properly and is very card RNG dependent. And while on the topic of demerits, the 3000 HP burn is nothing to sneeze at, since that's nearly 30% of Nobu's total HP. So even though the skill has a short cooldown, it can't exactly be spammed. I should also note that setting up a burning field can be situationally useful for some servants, including Mao Nobu herself, since it helps her trigger her second skill, as if it were a dream. This skill is a 1-turn invincibility that also increases her buff removal resistance by 100%. After her strengthening quest, it also buffs her damage against sky attribute enemies by 50% for 3 turns, so long as Burning Battlefield is active. If you're wondering which servants are Sky Attribute, it's essentially all the servants with Divinity, of which there are quite a few, and there are also many common enemies that have the Sky Attribute. At release, there isn't much else to say about this skill other than it provides some good hard defense for Nobu, and the buff removal resistance can be useful for preventing her invincibility and attack buffs from being removed. But post-strengthening, this skill becomes a strong anti-divine damage steroid, so overall it's highly versatile. And finally, Nobu has Demon King of the 6th Heaven. It generates 10 stars per turn for 3 turns, and it also charges Nobu's NP gauge by 20%. The star generating is basically a free 20-30, and because Nobu's star weight is so low, she can make an effective star generator for the team. But more importantly, the NP charge is tremendously useful for farming, especially given Nobu's AoE Noble Phantasm. That's why I do recommend leveling her Noble Phantasm charge first, since that 20% is huge, followed by her attack buff for obvious reasons, and then invincibility last. Nobu's Noble Phantasm is an AoE buster attack that deals additional damage to divine enemies, as well as removes their defensive buffs. It also burns all enemies. On its own, that burn isn't all that powerful, but it does last for 5 turns, so it can be useful for servants who deal bonus damage on burned enemies. Other than that though, as you can guess, this Noble Phantasm is meant to be used against divine enemies. Not only does it deal heavy damage to them, but it also removes all forms of defense from them. Unfortunately though, Nobu's NP doesn't work as well against non-divine enemies. The damage on it is incredibly low, and that is Mao Nobu's one major issue: lack of damage. Ironically, despite having one of the highest attack stats in the game, Nobu's DPS is far below that of most other 5-star buster servants. And that's mostly due to the lack of synergy between her kit and her class. As an Avenger, Nobu can't utilize class advantage on most enemies, which is a major drawback. But unlike Jolter or Dante's, who compensate for this by having insane crit damage or a loopable Noble Phantasm, Nobu doesn't have any crit buffs, nor any way of using the stars she generates. And her Noble Phantasm damage and NP gain are abysmal, which means that all of Nobu's damage has to come from her face cards. And that's a problem, because Nobu's only attack buff is wildly inconsistent. She has no control over what cards will be in your hand when her damage buff is at its strongest. Simply put, Nobu's class puts her at a massive disadvantage compared to other DPS servants, and her skills don't do enough to compensate for it, and they also don't have any synergy with each other. It isn't all doom and gloom though. Nobu does excel in one niche, and that's being anti-divine. After her strengthening, Nobu becomes one of the best all-around anti-divine servants due to her huge multi-turn damage buffs and her ability to nullify their defenses completely. Nobu can also make for a decent farmer against some low-level mobs thanks to her NP charge and the fact that her anti-sky damage applies to a wide range of enemies. For team comps, Nobu naturally only really works in heavy buster teams, and she needs supports who can significantly buff her buster damage, so that she can maintain some semblance of damage. Servants like Shakespeare, Nightingale, and Raiko Lancer all make for good choices when it comes to supporting Nobu. Shakespeare has a powerful single turn buster buff and an NP charge, so he can be very useful for maximizing Nobu's single turn damage with her Noble Phantasm, while Nightingale and Raiko have buster buffs with higher uptimes, which makes them better supports in longer fights. With enough star generating, it's also possible to use Nobu as a crit DPS. If you're aiming for that kind of strategy, then I recommend going with more specific crit supports like Summer BB, Mozart, and even Nobu Berserker. Mozart's Star Bomb will guarantee a turn of crits from Nobu regardless of how low her star weight is, while Summer BB and Zerker Nobu are both capable of providing constant stars every turn. Zerker Nobu is the better offensive option, and she can benefit from Mao Nobu's Burning Field, while Summer BB can freeze Demon Nobu's cards to mitigate the randomness of her attack buff. Demon Nobu's Bondcraft Essence is beyond the aeons. It increases the party's buster card effectiveness by 15% and NP damage by 10%, but it also lowers their defense by 10% as well. This isn't really worth using since Nobu isn't a support. It's better to give her CEs that focus on maximizing her own buster and NP damage like Limited Zero, Collide Ruby, Aerial Drive, and even Black Grail if she's up against divine enemies. For crit Nobu, use craft essences that boost buster and crit damage, or give star absorb, like Joint Recital, Victor from the Moon, Talk on the Hot Sands, or even Dance with the Round. In the future, Like a Bird is a great craft essence choice for Nobu since it does buff buster cards and buster crit damage, while Chains of Heaven is one of the best command codes for Nobu as it increases damage against divine enemies by 20%, which fits perfectly with Nobu's niche. Overall, Nobu is a generally underwhelming DPS with a very specific niche. Against most enemies, her damage is severely lacking due in large part to her lack of class advantage and her awkward skill set that doesn't really fit her playstyle, as well as her lack of a powerful Noble Phantasm and bad NP gain. However, Nobu can shine against Divine or Sky attribute enemies, especially post-buff, since she's able to more consistently output damage against them, and she can also make for a decent farmer against weaker enemies thanks to her AoE Noble Phantasm and good NP battery. That said, Nobu gets a C- from me at release, which is upgraded to a C+ after her strengthening quest, which will come out next year. As a 5-star servant, of course it's possible to make Nobu work in specific team comps, so she isn't completely unviable, but you'll find that her damage lags drastically behind nearly every other 5-star buster servant. And it's frustrating because all Nobu needs is a couple of quick fixes to become really good. Literally, if she just got an NP interlude and had the effect of her first skill flipped so that the 70% attack buff came first, that would make her leagues better. So here's hoping for another Nobu strengthening in JP. And those are my thoughts on Demon Lord Nobu. But as I always say, waifu before gameplay. So if Nobu is a character that you really like, I highly encourage you to roll for her regardless, and I wish you all the best of luck. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing if you really enjoyed the video. Join the party over at our Discord, chill with us on Twitch, and follow us on Twitter. And I'll see you all in the next Servant Spotlight. Soberoni out. Later.